The French Revolution is probably one of the most significant events in the last 300 years. And when most people think about it, it's all about freedom, equality, and brotherhood. But there's a darker side to this famous period in history that most people don't talk about. The French Revolution wasn't just about overthrowing a king, the storming of the Bastille, or the rise of egalitarian ideals. It is a story of violence, chaos, and shocking twists. And instead of bringing freedom to people, it threw them into a time of tyranny, terror, and treachery. Don't get me wrong, the French Revolution changed the world in some positive ways, but it didn't unfold like the fairy tale of democracy we often hear about. People were executed in public, starved to death, and some of the new leaders turned out to be just as bad as the rulers and kings they replaced. Welcome to Past Perspectives, and today we are digging deeper into what really happened during the French Revolution and why it was worse than you thought. We are going back to France in the 18th century and uncovering the hidden stories and surprises that make this part of history more complicated than you thought. This is the real story of the French Revolution. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you get to know all the history topics you've never learned about in school. To understand why the revolution was worse than you thought, we first need to take a look at the situation of France before the revolution started. At that point, France was like a ticking time bomb. They had a rigid class system with the royalty at the top. Monarchists and aristocracy lived in their palaces like there was no tomorrow, while the country itself was swimming in debt. They were having daily parties and extravagant feasts while their countrymen could barely afford a loaf of bread. Then we have a wealthy middle class and clergy who had money and some power, but they were constantly trying to expand their influence. Basically, they were stuck in the middle. They were able to afford food and live a relatively safe life, but they were stuck in the middle. And at the bottom, we have the working class folks, the peasants and workers. They were the backbone of the country, working the fields and filling the few factories France had at that time. However, they barely had enough to feed their families because the monarchists constantly raised taxes to fuel their expensive lifestyle. And those that suffered from it were the everyday people that carried the economy on their shoulders. Now, speaking of the economy, it was pretty much ruined. France during that time was bankrupt due to bad decisions by the king, expensive wars, and bad luck with crops. Prices left and right were skyrocketing, and the government seemed to be doing nothing about it. So basically, you had a country that kind of felt like a game of Jenga. It was only a matter of time until someone pulled the wrong block and everything would collapse. Looking at it from today's perspective, this block was the Enlightenment. It started an era that made people challenge everything they knew about life, governance, and human rights. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu started planting thoughts in the minds of people that changed the foundations of society. Thoughts like, why should a king have all the power? Why shouldn't people have a say in how they're governed? What if all men are born equal? From that point onwards, people became more and more unhappy with the status quo. And if we look into historical accounts, we can see that these questions changed something in the minds of the people. They went from just accepting their fate to debating these ideas in coffee houses, in letters, and in secret meetings. When the American Revolution succeeded across the ocean based on the same ideas and principles, the French realized that a revolt was not just possible, but a necessity. At this point, people knew there needed to be a change, and they just waited for the final straw. This fateful day was the 14th of July, 1789, a day that today is synonymous with parades, fireworks, and freedom. But back then, it was a day of desperation that symbolically started the French Revolution with the storming of the Bastille. Now, the Bastille wasn't just any building. For the people, it was the symbol of royal tyranny. A prison that loomed over Paris as a daily reminder of the king's absolute power. A group of 633 angry French citizens stormed the Bastille to gather weapons and show the regime that their oppression was now over. After the storm, the Bastille was in ruins, and the words liberty, equality, and fraternity became the soul of the revolution. But this was just the beginning of a time that would turn out worse than you thought, especially for the everyday people. However, at the beginning of the revolution, the revolutionaries were now committed to turn their ideas into realities, and inspired by the American Revolution, the National Assembly was formed, and they started working on a new constitution that would guarantee the rights of man. But it wasn't just as simple as writing down their ideas. Achieving these goals meant tearing down centuries of tradition, privilege, and a deeply ingrained social hierarchy. After a long period of debate about how the new constitution would work, the French Revolution took a radical turn when the revolutionaries were able to arrest the king. In the following month, the National Convention replaced the National Assembly, which was a more radical formation that wanted to establish a republic at all costs. And to set a sign that the monarchy was over forever, they executed the king as a traitor in January 1793. What at that point was believed to be a liberation from monarchy then took a dark and intense turn with the Reign of Terror. The hopes of a democratic society slowly turned into absolute horror for the French revolutionaries, and the era of the guillotine started. From 1793 to 1794, the so-called national razor was heavily used, and it was used against everybody who was deemed as an enemy of the revolution. At that point, from royalty to commoners, no one was safe. But who decided who lived and who died? This task fell to the Committee of Public Safety, which was led by Maximilien Robespierre. Now, the irony of this committee still baffles historians even to this day, as it had nothing to do with public safety. What was believed to be the liberation quickly turned into a public scare as this group started their own reign of purges, surveillance, and ruthless crackdowns. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were overshadowed by the insatiable hunger of Robespierre for vengeance and control. The longer the Committee of Safety had its power, the more the decision on who lived and died was made on how dangerous someone would be to the control of the committee. Picture this. You're living in Paris during the Reign of Terror, and you've just heard about the law of suspect. This decree basically gives authorities the power to arrest anyone on the flimsiest grounds. A little suspicion alone is enough to put you under the guillotine blade. Neighbors started turning on neighbors, and friends started betraying friends, all out of the fear of being next. And the situation for the everyday French citizen, who thought that the revolution would make their life better, actually got worse in many ways than before the revolution began. The economic hardships that had plagued the French people before the revolution, such as high taxes and food scarcity, got even worse through the political instability. Craftsmen, shopkeepers, and farmers, who were once the backbone of the economy, were either forced into the Revolutionary Army, executed, or simply too afraid to continue their work. Now, of course, the revolution had its reasons, but in countless historical accounts, you can find that a lot of citizens during that time believed that the French Revolution turned their situation for the worse due to the political imbalances. Their dreams of revolution and the ideas of enlightenment turned France into a terror machine driven by fear and radicalism. You can kind of describe this with the words that their situation went from bad to worse. However, in the midst of this despair, a new figure began to emerge on the national stage that promised stability, order, and put an end to the chaos. Napoleon Bonaparte was a young man that rapidly rose through the military ranks, and he saw the opportunity to seize power. On the battlefield, he was able to annex land that today is Belgium. He made the Dutch Republic surrender in peace with the Prussians and Spanish. These military successes made him a national hero, and people saw him as someone that is capable of restoring order in a nation that is ruled by terror. Internal conflicts in the Committee of Safety made it almost easy for Napoleon to sideline them and their instruments of terror. With his influence, political purges, mass executions, and arbitrary imprisonment ceased, which was a welcoming change many people desperately wanted for years. However, the irony of the French Revolution comes when Napoleon reached for power and against the revolutionary ideas of equality, liberty, and fraternity. On November 9, 1799, he appointed himself as France's first consul, and in May 1804, he declared himself as the Emperor of the French after he introduced numerous reforms in the government and brought back the stability to France. The question we have to ask ourselves now is if the French Revolution failed. There is no doubt that people were electrified by abandoning an outdated system of governance and building a France based on Enlightenment ideals. Additionally to that, it sparked revolutions across the globe that would break the way society worked forever. But for the French people, the reality turned out otherwise in the following years. The Reign of Terror and its end didn't bring stability, but it set the stage for Napoleon's rise to power. And while people were desperate for someone who would bring stability, which is exactly what he did along with some progressive reforms, he also declared himself the Emperor of the French, which effectively destroyed the ideas of the revolution, which was to establish a republic. And if you look at it from a very basic standpoint, Without looking at the details, France had swapped one form of tyranny for another. Thank you for joining us today at Past Perspectives. If you want to learn about more controversial views on history that aren't shown to you in school, make sure to subscribe to our channel. And with that being said, thanks for watching, and until next time.